Charles had been protecting Camilla's position for years, publicly, institutionally, constitutionally, with the full weight of his sovereign authority and the full investment of his personal capital deployed in service of securing what had been the most contested designation in the modern monarchy's recent history. He had fought for her title in circumstances where fighting for it had cost him something real. He had defended it against the public pressure that had never entirely resolved into acceptance, and against the institutional resistance that had never entirely converted into enthusiasm. He had made her position as secure as a sovereign can make another person's position within an institution that ultimately answers to its own survival requirements before it answers to any individual's claim on its protection. And then he had removed it himself, not under pressure, not in response to any external force that had finally overcome his defenses of her position. From the inside, from his own deliberate conclusion, reached privately and held with certainty before it was acted on, that the position he had spent years protecting had become the thing standing between the monarchy and the reconfiguration that the monarchy's survival now required. Camilla had not seen it coming because she had been watching for the wrong threat. The threat to her title had never been external. It had always been the moment Charles understood that protecting it was costing the institution more than removing it would. There is a specific kind of institutional decision that can only be made from inside, that cannot be forced from outside, cannot be produced by public pressure or parliamentary consideration, or any of the external forces that people who observe institutions from the outside tend to assume are the primary drivers of institutional change. The decision Charles made about Camilla's title was that kind of decision. It was a decision that required the specific vantage point of the sovereign, the particular view of the institution's complete operational reality that only the person at its center possesses, to be made with the certainty and the completeness that Charles brought to it. No one outside could have seen what Charles saw from inside. No one inside, at any position below the sovereign's, could have seen it with the same completeness. The decision was uniquely available to Charles from the position he occupied, and it was available to him only because he had occupied that position long enough and with enough genuine attention to what the position revealed about the institution to develop the understanding that the decision required. He had been developing that understanding across a period that the people closest to him have since characterized as the most significant sustained period of private deliberation of his reign. Not the most dramatic, not the most externally visible, but the most significant in the specific sense of being the period during which the deepest and most consequential conclusions about the monarchy's situation had been forming in his private thinking and moving toward the certainty that made action possible. The pattern Charles had identified was not a pattern that announced itself. That is the first thing to understand about why it took the length of time it took to arrive at certainty, and why the certainty, when it arrived, produced action as quickly and as decisively as it did. Patterns of institutional dysfunction, which is what Charles had been identifying and tracking, though he would not have used that specific terminology in his own private framing of what he was observing, do not present themselves as patterns in the early stages of their development. They present themselves as individual circumstances, each with its own specific context, and its own specific causes, and its own specific management requirements. It is only across time, and with the specific quality of attention that is willing to hold individual circumstances in relation to each other, rather than processing each one separately, that the pattern beneath the individual circumstances becomes visible. Charles had been holding individual circumstances in relation to each other for years. He had been tracking them not as separate incidents requiring separate management, but as expressions of something structural, something in the arrangement of the institution that was generating the circumstances rather than simply producing them as random events. And the pattern he had assembled across that tracking was the foundation on which the decision about Camilla's title had been built. The specific, documented, thoroughly tested understanding of what was generating the institutional friction that the title's current configuration was sitting at the center of. The circumstances that had contributed to the pattern were not all connected to Camilla directly. That is an important distinction that Charles was careful to make in the private conversations, through which he eventually shared the complete picture with the people who needed to have it. The distinction between circumstances that had involved Camilla specifically and circumstances that had involved the broader institutional configuration of which her position was one element. Some of the pattern's components had involved her directly. Specific instances in which the operational reality of her position within the monarchy had generated friction with the operational requirements of other positions within it in ways that the formal designation of her title had not resolved, and that the formal designation's authority had not been sufficient to manage without cost to the institution's internal functioning. Others had involved broader structural questions about the monarchy's configuration that Camilla's position was implicated in without being the primary cause of questions about the clarity of roles, the coherence of the institution's public-facing structure, the alignment between formal designations and actual operational functions that had been developing across the accumulated complexity of the monarchy's recent institutional history. Charles had been tracking both categories with equal seriousness, and the pattern he had assembled from both had pointed toward the same conclusion from two different directions simultaneously. That convergence was the moment Charles had moved from observation to certainty. When the evidence from the direct circumstances and the evidence from the broader structural circumstances pointed at the same element of the current configuration as the most significant source of the institutional friction he had been tracking, the question of what the evidence required had answered itself. Camilla had been aware that something was shifting in the institutional environment around her in the weeks before Charles told her what he had decided. She had not been able to read it with the specificity that her years of institutional sensitivity would normally have provided her, had been picking up signals without being able to assemble them into a coherent picture of what they were signaling, which was itself unusual enough to be significant to someone as attuned to the palace's internal dynamics as she had become. The signals had been subtle in the specific way that Charles manages things he is not yet ready to make visible, present enough to be sensed by someone paying close attention, contained enough to resist the kind of assembly into pattern that would allow them to be identified clearly before he was ready for them to be identified. Camilla had been paying close attention. She had sensed something. She had not been able to name it. And the inability to name something she could sense had produced in her the specific quality of watchful alertness that the people around her had noted in the weeks before Charles told her, a heightened attention to the environment, a slightly increased carefulness in how she navigated the institutional spaces where the signals had been present, a quality of preparation for something she could not yet specifically prepare for because she did not yet know what it was. Charles told her on a morning that had not been marked in any way that suggested the day was different from the days surrounding it. No unusual scheduling, no clearing of the calendar that would have signaled to Camilla or to the staff around her that something significant was being prepared. The conversation was not preceded by the kind of visible institutional preparation that surrounds formal decisions of constitutional weight when those decisions are being managed through the normal channels. It happened in the specific conditions that Charles had determined were the right conditions, private, personal, without the institutional management that would have introduced between him and Camilla the kind of formal distance that the conversation's content could not afford. He needed to be her husband telling her something difficult, rather than her sovereign communicating a constitutional decision. Both things were true simultaneously, but the husband had to come first. The sovereign's decision would be real, and would stand regardless of how the conversation went. The husband's presence in the conversation was the element that Charles had the most control over, and that he had been most deliberate in protecting across the preparation for it. Camilla asked one question before Charles had finished the initial statement of what he had decided. She did not ask about the title itself, or about the constitutional mechanics of how its removal would be effected, or about the public dimensions of what the change would mean for how she was received and understood outside the palace. She asked why now, not why at all. She was sophisticated enough about the institutional dynamics Charles was describing to understand the structural logic of the decision, once he had given her the initial statement of it. But why this moment? What had changed in this specific period that had converted what she understood had been a long-developing private deliberation into a decision that was now being communicated to her as made and final? The question told Charles something about the quality of Camilla's reception of what he was telling her, that she had understood immediately that the decision's timing was as significant as its content, and that understanding the timing was the key to understanding the decision in its complete form, rather than simply in its most visible surface expression. Charles answered the timing question with the honesty it deserved, with the specific honesty of someone who has committed to bringing no less than the complete truth to a conversation that the relationship it concerns demands complete truth from. He told Camilla that the timing had been determined by the convergence he had observed between the direct circumstances and the broader structural circumstances. The moment when the evidence from both directions had pointed at the same conclusion simultaneously and removed the remaining uncertainty that had been the reason the decision had remained in the deliberation stage rather than moving to the action stage across the earlier period of the pattern's development. He told her that the convergence had arrived recently and that he had moved from it to the decision with a speed that reflected the certainty the convergence had produced, rather than any external urgency that had forced his hand. And he told her that the decision about her title was the first action the convergence required, the most immediate and most visible element of a reconfiguration whose further dimensions he intended to walk her through in the conversation that followed. Camilla received this last statement with the particular quality of stillness that arrives when someone has understood that what they are receiving is larger than they had initially estimated. She had understood from Charles's first statement that the conversation concerned something significant. She now understood that significant had been an underestimate. The question Camilla asked, when the initial reception of what Charles had told her had settled enough for her to begin engaging with its implications, was the question Charles had been expecting across the full preparation for this conversation. Had been expecting because it was the question that her specific understanding of their shared history inside the institution inevitably produced once she had the complete initial picture. She asked Charles whether the decision was connected to the years he had spent protecting her position, whether the protecting itself, the specific investment of sovereign authority and personal capital in securing what had been contested, had contributed to the conditions that the decision was now responding to. It was the most searching question she could have asked. It was searching in the way that only questions from people who know you completely can be searching, reaching past the institutional surface of the decision into the personal history that surrounded it. Asking about the relationship between what Charles had done for her and what he was now doing about her in a way that required him to be honest, not just about the decision, but about the full arc of the choices that had preceded it, and the understanding of that arc that the kingship's vantage point had eventually provided. Charles answered it, completely and honestly in the way the question and the relationship demanded. And his answer was the thing that changed the quality of Camilla's reception from the composed engagement she had been bringing to the conversation into something more personal and more difficult. Not because the answer was cruel or accusatory or placed responsibility on her for the conditions the decision was responding to, but because it was honest in the specific way that honesty about the relationship between love and institutional consequence is always difficult when the love has been real and the consequence has been real, and the person receiving the honest accounting is the person both of them have been lived through. What Charles said in that answer, the specific articulation of what the kingship's vantage point had shown him about the arc, from his long protection of Camilla's position to the decision he had just communicated, was the most personal thing he had said about their shared life inside the institution to anyone, including Camilla herself, across the full length of their marriage and his reign. And it was also the thing that connected the decision about her title to the plan's broader dimensions in a way that Camilla, receiving it, understood was not going to remain between the two of them. That would eventually need to reach William and Anne and the institutional environment that the plan was designed to reconfigure. Because what Charles had articulated was not simply his own personal understanding of a personal history. It was the key to everything the plan was built to address. And Camilla, sitting with it in that private room with her husband who was also her king, understood that the conversation she had just had was not the end of something. It was the beginning of everything that came next, and that what came next was going to be the most significant thing that had happened to the monarchy since Charles had become its sovereign. What Charles had articulated in that final honest answer to Camilla's most searching question was something he had been moving toward across the full length of his private deliberation without knowing, until the moment he said it, that it was what the deliberation had been building toward. That is the specific quality of insight that arrives only through the kind of sustained, honest, unmanaged internal process that Charles had been conducting. Not the insight that you are looking for and find when you look hard enough, but the insight that arrives when you have been honest long enough about everything surrounding a question that the question's deepest answer finally becomes visible, not as a discovery, but as a recognition. Charles had recognized something about the relationship between his protection of Camilla's position and the institutional conditions that protection had helped to create. Not that the protection had been wrong in the way that a mistake is wrong. It had been an expression of genuine love and genuine commitment, and it had been right in every personal dimension that mattered to the man who had extended it. But it had been extended inside an institution whose requirements and whose personal dimensions do not always move in the same direction, and the extension of it across the full period of its extension had produced institutional conditions that the personal rightness of the protection had never been required to account for. Charles had finally accounted for them, and the accounting had been the key that unlocked everything the plan was built to address. Camilla had sat with what Charles said for longer than she sat with anything else, across the full length of that conversation. The conversation had covered significant and difficult ground before it arrived at Charles's answer to her most searching question, had covered the decision itself and the structural logic behind it, and the pattern of circumstances that had produced the convergence that had moved the decision from deliberation to action. She had received all of that with the composed, engaged attention she had brought to the conversation from its beginning. But Charles's answer to her question about the relationship between his protection and the conditions the decision was responding to required something different from her than composed, engaged attention. It required her to sit with something that connected the most personal dimensions of their shared history to the most institutional dimensions of the decision he had just made, in a way that did not allow the personal and the institutional to be processed separately. They were the same thing in Charles's answer. The protection had been personal and institutional simultaneously. Its consequences had been personal and institutional simultaneously. And the decision that was responding to those consequences was personal and institutional simultaneously in the same way. Camilla had spent years managing the complexity of occupying a position where the personal and the institutional were never entirely separable. She had never received an accounting of that complexity that went as deep as the one Charles had just given her. And going that deep required time that she took without apology and that Charles gave her without interruption. When she spoke, what she said was not what Charles had prepared himself to receive, not because he had prepared himself for something specific, which would have been a mistake in a conversation whose nature required him to remain genuinely open to whatever Camilla brought to it, but because what she said revealed a dimension of her own understanding of their shared history inside the institution that Charles had not known she possessed in the specific articulated form in which she now expressed it. She told him that she had known. Not everything he had just told her, not the institutional analysis, not the pattern he had been tracking, not the convergence that had produced the decision's timing, but the thing beneath the analysis, the personal core of what the analysis had been built around. She had known that the protection had costs that neither of them had been required to account for across the period of its extension. She had known it in the specific way that people who are the recipients of protection inside complicated institutional environments know things about the cost of their protection that the people extending it are sometimes the last to see clearly. She had carried that knowing without naming it, had held it in the specific private way that certain kinds of knowledge are held when naming them would introduce into a relationship a complexity that the relationship is managing without the naming, and that the naming would require both people to deal with before either of them is ready to deal with it productively. She had not named it because the time had not been right. Charles naming it now was the time being right, and what she felt in the moment of his naming it was not the relief that people feel when a difficult truth is finally said. It was something more complicated than relief, something that combined the recognition of truth with the specific grief that comes from understanding how long both of them had been living alongside something neither of them had been ready to say. Charles received this with the quality of genuine surprise that arrives rarely in a man who has spent a lifetime developing the capacity to anticipate what the people around him are carrying. He had not known Camilla had been holding this. He had believed, across the full period of his private deliberation and the developing of the understanding that the deliberation had produced, that the insight was his alone, that what the kingship's vantage point had revealed to him was something Camilla had not been able to see from her position, something the distance of his specific vantage point had made visible in a way that her position inside the protected arrangement had not allowed. He had been wrong about that. Camilla had been seeing it from inside. She had been seeing it in the specific way that the recipient of protection sees the cost of protection, from closer than the person extending it, with less of the distance that makes the cost analyzable, but with more of the intimacy that makes the cost felt. She had felt it without being able to analyze it with the analytical distance Charles's vantage point had eventually provided. And now they had both seen it, from their different positions, and were sitting with the same understanding arrived at through entirely different paths. The convergence between them was as significant as the institutional convergence that had produced the decision's timing. Both convergences had happened in the same period. Charles had not understood until this moment that they were connected. The plan's most personal element, the element Charles had held back from every conversation in the disclosure sequence, including the earlier portions of this conversation with Camilla, was the element that their shared recognition in that moment had finally made possible to share. Because the most personal element required the shared understanding they had just arrived at as its context. Without that shared understanding as the foundation, the most personal element would have been receivable as information, as another dimension of the plan's comprehensive architecture, but not as the thing it actually was, which was the reason the plan existed at all, the reason beneath the structural logic, the reason beneath the pattern of circumstances and the convergence of evidence and the institutional analysis that had assembled themselves into the decision and the plan. The reason that had been present from the beginning of the deliberation, and that the deliberation had been, at its deepest level, an extended process of finding the honest courage to acknowledge. Charles told Camilla the most personal element in the specific conditions their shared recognition had created. The conditions of two people who have just discovered that they have been seeing the same truth from different positions, and who are therefore able to receive the deepest articulation of that truth together rather than one of them receiving it from the other. He told her that the plan had been built from a determination that what the institution had cost the people within it across the period of their shared experience inside it would not be the model for what it cost the people within it across the period that followed. That the specific costs, the ones both of them had now named in their different ways, the ones that the protection and its consequences had generated, had been accepted as necessary during the period they had been generated because no alternative framework for managing the institution's requirements had been available, and that the plan was the alternative framework, built from the honest accounting of what the previous framework had cost, designed to replace the cost-generating configurations with configurations whose design requirement included the well-being of the people within them as explicitly as it included the institutional continuity that had always been the primary design requirement before. Charles told Camilla that she was not simply the person most directly affected by the plan's first decision. She was the person whose experience inside the institution had been the most direct source of the understanding that the plan had been built from. The protection he had extended and its costs, and the honest accounting of both, all of it had been the education that the plan required its architect to have received before he could build something genuinely responsive to what the institution actually did to the people within it. Camilla had been, without either of them understanding it in these terms during the period it was happening, the most important teacher of the understanding the plan was built from. Camilla was quiet for a long time after Charles finished. The quietness was different from all the quietnesses that had preceded it in the conversation, different from the composed reception of difficult information, and different from the sitting with personal complexity, and different from the processing of the shared recognition they had arrived at together. It was the quietness of someone who has just been given a completely unexpected understanding of their own significance inside a story they had understood themselves to be subject to, rather than central to. She had understood herself, across the full period of her life inside the monarchy, as someone navigating an institution rather than shaping one, as someone whose primary relationship to the institutional forces around her was one of management and endurance rather than contribution and influence. Charles had just told her that the most significant contribution to the most significant thing he had done as king had been hers, not through any action she had taken, through what her experience had made visible to the person responsible for seeing it clearly and building from it honestly. What Camilla said when the quietness ended was something Charles has not shared outside the private room where it was said, something that belongs to the specific privacy of two people who have arrived together at the deepest level of a shared truth and whose words at that level are not institutional property and never will be. What he has shared with the very small number of people he has spoken to about the conversation is that what she said changed something in his understanding of what he had built, not the plan's architecture, which was complete and would proceed as designed, but his understanding of what the plan meant beyond its institutional function. And that changed understanding was the thing he carried into the subsequent conversations with William and Anne and the senior royals. The thing that gave those conversations a quality that the people receiving them have consistently noted as different from every previous conversation they had had with Charles about the plan's dimensions. He was no longer simply communicating a sovereign's decision. He was carrying something that two people who had been through something real together had arrived at in a private room, and that had changed, in the arriving, what the decision meant and what it was for.